Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. If you're watching us on YouTube, just so you know, you can check us out wherever fine podcasts are purveyed for the audio edition that you can listen to anywhere. If you're listening to us on the podcast format, you can tune in and watch us on our YouTube channel. Go and check those out. Leave a review. Let your friends and family members know. Spread the word about how much you're enjoying the Lunch Hour podcast. Very excited to have our guest join us today. His name is Thomas Ayres. He is the Chief Legal Officer and General Counsel for an entity called Voyager Space. He is a retired Army Major General, having served over 33 years on active duty. Tom is a veteran of multiple combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. He has extensive litigation experience and has led large legal teams to include being the deputy leader of the Army's Judge Advocate General's Corps. In civilian life, Tom was a CEO and consultant, and earlier was selected by the President and confirmed by the Senate to be the 20th General Counsel of the Department of the Air Force. In that role, he was the Chief Legal and Compliance Officer for an organization with an annual operating revenue of equivalent to a Fortune 20 company. He also led a team to draft and then implement the legislation creating Space Force, simultaneously becoming the first General Counsel for the U.S. Space Force. I'm going to open up with a question about that, General. He's a distinguished graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point. He began his military career as an airborne rifle platoon leader in Italy, and he earned his Juris Doctorate from the University of Pennsylvania School of Law. Now, let me ask you this, given your multi-service experience, and I am a military dependent. I am the spouse of a career officer who served 25 years in the Air Force. We know what the Army theme song is. We know what the Air Force theme song is. We were on a cruise recently where they played the themes. They honored folks who were part of Space Force on this cruise. Do you recall, is there a song for members of the Space Force?
There is now a song. When I was there, the 3 years that I served as the General Counsel of the Department of the Air Force, probably about the last year, we had Congress had approved and the President signed into law the law that created the United States Space Force. And in that first year, we were really focused on trying to do more meaningful things than create songs and uniforms and things like that. Of course, that all comes with being a service. So they worked on that, and I think recently they have approved a song. They also,
is it Space Cowboy by the Steve Miller Band? Because that to me would be that or the Star Trek theme.
That would not be bad. That would not be a bad choice, Andrew.
Yeah. Because a lot of folks don't know the Star Trek theme actually has words. That way Gene Roddenberry could get a song credit. I'm sorry. I digress greatly here. We're going to talk. Listen, I had a conversation with General Ayres a couple of years ago on the radio. Wanted to bring him back to talk about a fascinating theory about how to deal with cyber criminals. We're going to get to that in a minute. I want to spend some time talking about privatized space flight. But let's start with talking about the creation of Space Force, if you don't mind. A lot of folks ridiculed it, but I wrote a piece essentially talking about how we in America, we recognized that while we had an Army Air Corps that served us during World War II, that after World War II we decided, something? There is enough of there are air entities, air warfare entities in the Army, there are air warfare entities in the Navy and the Marine Corps, but that we did need a specialized United States Air Force. We are now at a point where we do need a specialized United States Space Force. Talk about why that is.
Yeah, I'd say, the reasons why you have a service is to lay out the doctrine and thinking, to think about a domain in a different way. And then also, you're in Washington, D.C., the other thing the service does, it talks to Congress about the requirements for what is needed, the funding that is needed to ensure that we're ready for what's next. And so as I think about the creation of the Space Force, two things come to mind. First, the saying that when you talk about space and all the very expensive satellites we have in space and our everyday life depends on space, right? The blue dot on your phone is provided by the Department of the Air Force. Timing of Wall Street transactions and every ATM transaction, tractors that are, out in the fields right now by farmers. Everything relies upon space. And we built those, as we say, we built those glass houses in a world without stones. There's now a world with stones in space. There are potential competitors who would like to take away our ability to use space for our everyday life. And of course, many military operations, many military systems rely on those same space capabilities, whether it's communications capabilities, whether it's what's called intelligence, ISR capabilities, and the GPS, again, the dot on your phone. So that's the major reason that Space Force was needed. But I think, again, back to the idea of funding, when you look at how some other nations were funding their Space Force and their space capabilities, we weren't keeping pace, particularly when you look at China was doing in terms of potential offensive and defensive capabilities in space. And so somebody who could talk about the space needs specifically was very important.
Because I don't have an answer to this, and I'm actually going to ask a number of these questions agnostically. Obviously, NASA has the civilian side of things, as does National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. They have components in this as well. But do we need, I suppose we do, but you can answer this question, do we need to keep the civilian and the military or national security side of space policy separate? Other nations don't. It's all done through their military, at least I think it is. But how do we sort of bifurcate the two?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, Andrew. But it's just like, there are a lot of areas where the analogies to the seas, the high seas and space don't work, but maybe this is one where it does work, right? Sure. You need to be able to explore the seas, commercially use the seas, but then you also need, as with any commercial endeavor, right? There are people who would want to be pirates, who would want to take advantage or would want to gain some leverage over your operations, your commercial operations, whether they be nation states or criminals. And so you need some type of way to protect that. And so I think, if you think of space and the high seas right now, what's been in the space high seas has been just nation states. And so we're now seeing that that's starting to flip, right? The number of satellites, where you're talking about SpaceX and Intelsat and a number of Maxar, all these different satellite companies, they're providing satellite services apart from the government. It used to be that the government was the only one building them and sending them, but now the government is more they're buying services rather than actually building many of the satellites. We still have quite a few of those satellites that were government built, government run, but there's also this idea of those space services as space as a service rather than bought.
Who would have thought, and I didn't want to jump the gun and talk about the letters of marque issue early on, but we may have to. Who would have thought that sort of maritime law would sort of extend in this way, predicted just how important this was going to be? Actually, before we get there, let's set that as an aside for right now. Okay. Because as we talk about this, all I can think about is the issue of, okay, we have these things we need to defend. Do we need a special now cybersecurity service on par with a Space Force, Air Force, Marine Corps, et cetera? Do we need to be going down that road, or should it still be continued within all of these agencies?
Yeah. So I think for right now we've got the right solution. We needed a Space Force, and one of the things I'll say about creating the Space Force. So one of the first things the creation of the Space Force did was it created a member of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. So a chief of the United States Space Force. Now, in law, what is required is that every year, the budget is sent over by the president, sent over by the Pentagon. And the budget, each of the services asks for their amount of money. And what is required in law is that the uniform member, different than the political representatives and the civilian leadership of the military, is asked by Congress, what did you not get funded? And why do you think you not get funded? And so within the first year, you had the chief of the United States Space Force, who now submitted his list of what didn't get funded. In the past, when the Department of the Air Force, not against them, it's just they had an air-centric view of the world. So what didn't get funded was this kind of fighter, this kind of refueler, this kind of bomber, right? Now you've got that list, but then you've also got the list of what was always below the Department of the Air Force's line, these space things. So you had this this new world where Congress saw what was not funded in space. So if you created a cyber force, you would probably get that right. You'd now have more oversight by Congress and by the American people about what is above and below the line and what needs to be funded. But I would also say that I think that cyber is a little bit different because you have some, you mentioned about NASA, the difference between NASA and the Space Force.
Yeah.
I think cyber is primarily a civilian realm, right? It's primarily where our commerce operates, and it's civilian agencies, whether it be national security agencies or others, who can defend that realm. And it's not necessarily, I'm not sure it should be uniform people in the lead there. It could become an area of war, right? But I think primarily it's an area of commerce.
Well, and then actually this is really good because it does get us into this letters of marque issue because, I've had conversations here on this show and elsewhere about the important role that the merchant marine plays in national security and can play in national security. And we've always maintained that. So in case there is a situation in which we need to backfill our shipping capabilities or our national security capabilities on the water, we can rely on the merchant marine program. It's part of the reason why folks want to maintain the Jones Act. So I appreciate what you have to say there. And let's talk about this then. Let's because it does open up the door. You wrote about this. Some folks in proceedings at the U.S. Naval Institute Press have written about this issue. Talk about the issue of letters of marque and how that can play into ongoing cybersecurity and cyber warfare.
Yeah, so the whole idea of letters of marque, I could probably go on too long, so you might want to interrupt me at some point, Andrew.
Take your time. That's why, listen, this is why we're having these conversations. Unlike when we're on talk radio, right, we can get really in-depth and into the weeds. That's what our listeners want. So please, go ahead.
So I would say, first of all, letters of marque, the term itself, you wouldn't think, it's from a French term. Maybe they called it marquet. I don't know. I don't know how they pronounced it. But letters of marque were around before the creation of the United States. And what it was a way for government to deputize, in some ways, a ship, the owner of a ship, to defend themselves and also to attack others. And so, and very much like the Merchant Marine in some ways, a little bit similar to CRAF, the Civilian Reserve Air Force. So, we can talk more about CRAF if you like later. But this idea that you take something civilian and you give it a military nature, you give it some type of ability to act on behalf of the nation. And so, what's really interesting is the fact that letters of marque are in the Constitution,
right?
And as I say, there's not that many words in the Constitution. There's not many sections of the Constitution. So when you have Congress can actually grant letters of marque, then maybe we ought to pay attention to that. And so the last time that a letter of marque was granted was during World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor. A letter of marque was granted to not a Goodyear blimp, but a blimp like the Goodyear blimp called the Resolute. And there was concern that attacks would happen on the West Coast. So a blimp was given a letter of marque to patrol the coast and see if there were any, ships coming into Los Angeles.
Sure. And
so that's if we could extend letters of marque in 1941 from ships to airplanes, well, then maybe we should think about it, in space as well. But to go back, the time they were most used historically by the United States under the Constitution was in the 1805 era with the Barbary pirates.
Sure, of course.
So there was concern about, American shipping in the Mediterranean was being attacked by pirates in the Mediterranean. And so the size of the Navy was minuscule. I mean, at one point, I think in about 1805, the Navy had one ship, a 14-gun sloop Enterprise.
Yeah.
And so that ship couldn't do everything on its own. So it's lots of commercial vendors put some cannons on your ship, and go fight back against these pirates, and we'll give you a letter of marque.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it bespeaks this idea of, and you were a career Army officer, and you then served as General Counsel of the Air Force. So clearly you are pro-military, as am I. But it underscores that, at least with the founders' image, they recognize that, A, they wanted to keep the civilian military, I know that's a weird way of putting it, but they wanted to keep the federal government's military small, but they also knew that they were going to have to backfill this. And that's what leads to the situation now, is that, as good as our capabilities are in terms of cybersecurity and cyber warfare, and we've got literally billions of dollars being spent on that every year, still there are folks who want to attack us. We've had just some very recent examples of this going after, state and local government infrastructures and other kinds of civilian infrastructures. The federal government can't be everywhere. State governments can't be everywhere. Right. So let's talk about. So we declare cyber criminals to be pirates, essentially. Do we have to do that? And then where do we go from there?
Yeah, so I think you make a great point, Andrew, that when you look at the Microsofts and the Googles and the Amazons, I mean, the amount of money and their resources to defend themselves and to potentially fight back, much greater than what probably the federal government could do, And then you've got lots of innovative young companies too. And so I think that the idea behind the letter of marque is, in the letter of marque, to just further unpack that a little bit. When
Please.
You gave a letter of marque to a captain of a ship, that ship then, it could go fight a pirate. And the real incentive for them to go fight the pirates was that if they captured that pirate ship and, whatever ships the pirate ship was tagging along behind it that it had taken and all the cargo, they could then take those titles of those ships and all the cargo, and they could bring it to an admiralty court, and they could become the rightful owners of those ships and all that cargo. So it was, there was a financial incentive to get these letter of marques and then go after those pirates. So the idea would be the same thing. How do we financially incentivize these large cyber companies and smaller companies to help us in this fight where the federal government can't do it alone?
So then they would go out there, and it's I see it in two ways, right? You have the folks who have been attacked could go and turn around and go after whomever, or you have a whole industry that could crop up, right? We already know that some of the major cybersecurity companies, Cisco comes to mind, have white hat hackers. Folks who are doing good work, but who are in this business of engaging in this behavior for cybersecurity reasons. So there's no reason why, right? I mean, a whole new kind of computer business could spring up dealing with this, couldn't they?
Yeah, it sure could. And I think that the most analogous, incentives to the letters of marque about pirates is actually if somebody could go back and recover data, could recover stolen Bitcoin or things like that. That's one thing. But I think, the difference here, and could still be used by a letter of marque, is you really need some defensive, how do we ensure that these companies are helping the nation stay secure, right? When I think of the Colonial Pipeline hack, right, and the dark winds, right, and all of us on the East Coast, I'm now in Denver with Voyager Space as the company, but on the East Coast, we all sat in long gas lines for a while because of a hack.
Sure.
So, and what you had in that case, and in many cases when someone gets hacked, the company doesn't want to admit it at first, right? They're afraid that their brand name, the publicity that's come with that, their shares, their stock prices are going to immediately go down because they just got hacked, right? It could be multi-billion losses, even in excess of what was just hacked. And so there are these disincentives to report early on. Each of them, many companies, they have to make a profit and loss calculation about what defensive measures they put in place. And so, if you had a letter of marque, you could do a couple things. You could give them some type of indemnity and insurance when they were defending themselves. If they have bots that would automatically react and fight back and counterattack, some type of indemnity for that. And then some type of assurance that if they immediately report to federal agencies, the NSA, the National Security Agency, or others, that it still might get out. Their brands and their stock price still might go down. But what wouldn't happen is that a federal regulator or a state regulator wouldn't go in and fine them for not protecting consumer and public data. And that's one thing. Uber, Equifax, Home Depot, they've all been fined in millions of dollars for times when criminals, really, cyber criminals, fought their way in and got their data, and then they were fined for not doing enough to go against that. So
it essentially, it's a situation that creates perverse disincentives, because you're damned if you're doing, you're damned if you don't. But I mean, you have, as we said, you've got a career in the United States Army. You went to West Point. You've served as General Counsel of the Air Force. You understand the concept of creating disincentives for the enemy, right? Yep. It's the concept of mutually assured destruction. Talk about how granting letters of marque and actually taking the offensive in terms of cybersecurity, reacting more promptly. How do you suspect, because Lord knows I suspect that it could have huge impacts in terms of discouraging bad behavior or bad actors. Where do you come down on this?
Yeah, I think it could have a huge beneficial effect on discouraging bad behavior. Because first of all, the major actor in this area is the National Security Agency, right? They're the ones that are trying to stop the cyber criminals at the gates. The problem is that they're like any agency. They can't look at U.S. citizens, right? So what then the cyber criminals do is they use our laws against us. They create their servers in the United States. They try to pose themselves as U.S. citizens. And obviously there are some cyber criminals who are U.S. citizens. So there's then you're talking about the FBI and the NSA having to work together, and that they've gotten better at that over the years, particularly with the threats. But if you've got folks with letters of marque, they're not going to necessarily have to go do the same things that the NSA and the FBI do to go get warrants and to appear before judges and things like that. And in cyber, everything happens very quickly.
Right.
So we're talking about those kind of delays are problematic. The other thing, like with the letters of marque, the schooners and others that were against the Barbary pirates in 1805. There is a concern, the pirates used safe haven. They would go into the territorial waters of Morocco or wherever, and then the United States couldn't go in and find them, because then it's an act of war against the territory of Morocco or the country of Morocco. And so the same thing. There are lots of cyber criminals, hackers, who are using friendly nations, neutral nations, and not so neutral nations as safe haven, where we can't go and counter attack them, and where bots wouldn't go if there's a federal actor trying to counterpunch against them.
Listen, it is that we know that both China and Russia are going to use these tactics against us, with non-state actors sort of going down this road. What do we need to do? What needs to happen? How has the landscape for getting this adopted changed since you started talking about it a couple of years ago and others have been talking about it for 3-4 years?
Yeah, so after I first wrote this article, we did start talking to some staffers on the Hill. We started to look at some legislation to actually implement this. Frankly, as I left DC and got more involved in this company now, I'm more focused upon Voyager and NRX. We have the biggest contract from NASA to replace the International Space Station with a commercial space station.
I want to talk about this. Yeah.
And so I've been more focused on that now. So I've kind of lost the bubble on how the fledgling efforts, but there were quite a few people who were very, became advocates of the idea.
I'm going to talk to folks. I'm going to talk to folks about picking up that mantle and running with it. Listen, before we get to talk about what Voyager Space is doing, you were General Counsel of the Air Force, at Space Force. I'm assuming, because you're an Army retiree, you're a TRICARE. Maybe you're not. Maybe you're not a TRICARE beneficiary. Have you been following the transformation of the various medical services under the Defense Health Agency? Were you involved at all with that?
I sure was. Well, I was when I was General Counsel of the Air Force, that was starting to happen. There was a lot of concern about military commanders losing control over the hospitals on their installations, and there was a lot of desire, though, also to really, cut costs. Right? I mean, there's nothing more expensive than medical health, and so when you look at the overall budget of the United States, much of it goes to Medicare and Medicaid. But also, when you look at the budget of the military, much of it goes to those benefits as well. So, how do you create efficiencies there so we can have more soldiers, have more tanks, have more fighters? That's important. It's an important balancing act.
Yeah, at some point, you and I maybe offline need to have a conversation about DHA and their new electronic health record system, because I've been trying to peel that back. We'll set that aside for a moment. So let's talk about this. So I've done a lot on space and privatized space and the public-private partnerships, and much in the same way that our that state-funded exploration of the seas gave way to private-funded exploration and private use of the seas. Eventually, this is going to happen with space. Right. Talk about, I guess I didn't even realize that there was a next generation post the International Space Station, but it makes sense, right? The IHS has been around for almost 30 years now?
Yeah, almost. And it was originally supposed to cease existence, and its useful life in 2025. It's been extended to 2030. And so our space station, our plan is to launch it by late 2028. So it is very similar to, as you said, sea exploration, but it's also very similar to launch, right?
Yeah.
We went from when John F. Kennedy gave his speech to, up until the Challenger and the space shuttles, it was the United States government who was building rockets and the ability to get to the moon and into space. Yep. And at some point after the shuttle program was ended, there was a desire to move to launch as a service. So rather than the government building the rocket to get into space, let's buy it. And so that's what then, you now have SpaceX, you have Boeing, ULA, you have Blue Origin, who have all built rockets. And that's NASA then promising to buy some number of launches from those organizations that help them with the capital to build their rockets. So the same idea is that we've got, the United States and Russia teamed together to build the space station, and other countries are now part of that effort. But the government shouldn't be building a space station. Let's let commercial build it. And so they put out a what's called a Space Act Agreement. There were 12 competitors for the replacement of the International Space Station with a commercial space station. There were 3 winners of the design phase, and that was our company, NanoRacks, Voyager Space, Blue Origin, and Northrop Grumman. And so we're all working to design and build the space station. One of the things we want to do is ensure that there's not a gap. There was a gap in launch. There was a time.
Yes, this is important. Yes.
Yeah, it's very important. There was a period of time that we had to use Russian rockets to get to the International Space Station because
which is astounding.
Transitioning from the shuttle program to launch as a service program, there was a gap. We don't want a gap now. The other reason we don't want a gap, there are, as Jay Raymond said when he's the chief of the Space Force, he has a huge AOR, area of responsibility. Everything outside of our atmosphere is the Space Force and Space Command are responsible for that. Well, there are 10 people. There are only 10 people in that AOR. Wow. 7 of them are normally on this International Space Station. 3 are on the Chinese space station. They have a full-time manned space station right now. And so once the International Space Station ceases to operate, we need to have a U.S. presence in low Earth orbit.
I am reminded of that scene early on in the HBO series From the Earth to the Moon, where someone makes the statement, "A red moon, who wants to live under that?" And these are very important things. So is the next step, is Voyager going to be involved in, right? Because to me, right, because interplanetary spacecraft are entirely different than spacecraft that would go from the Earth to the moon, because of distances, et cetera. It would seem to me that if you're building the next International Space Station, you can also build the next, whatever the next ship is that goes to Mars. All you need to do is attach an engine to it. Is that in the plans for Voyager Space?
So it is, but we are singularly right now focused on the commercial space station. We need to get that built. There are certainly parts of our technologies that will be used on lunar missions and other missions. There are other companies that are very involved, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, SpaceX, that are very involved in looking at the lunar missions that are upcoming, and that's great. And we're teaming with them. Some of our technologies are being used in some of those missions as well. But and we do think, right, having human presence in low Earth orbit in a space station is going to be very important to lunar missions in the future and beyond lunar missions. So you need a staging base. You need we need to, all the experiments that we're going to work on, both Ayres experiments, pharma experiments, but also just continuing to have humans and the health effects on humans when they're in space, and then working out things like refueling. All those things are going to be needed for a long-term presence, not only in low Earth orbit, but also cislunar and lunar as well.
Oh, without that, let's pull it back a little bit here, because we haven't gone through, and I've never talked to you about sort of your background. I mean, you started off, you went to West Point, you came out as doing airborne infantry. Yep. And did you ever think when you came out of West Point that you were going to be involved in, returning Americans to long-term operations in space? How did that happen? How did that go on in your career?
Well, I like some philosopher who said, God writes straight with crooked lines. When you're in the middle of the loops of the writing, a lot of it doesn't make sense. You look back over your life and say, okay, it all kind of fit together. And so that's kind of how I feel now. I wanted to be infantry. My father was an infantryman, served in Korea and Vietnam. But then I sat on a court-martial panel, got interested in the law, just wanted to litigate and continue to litigate. I like my father, I thought I'd do 20 years and benefit from TRICARE and all those kind of programs.
Sure.
But at 20 years, I was in Iraq in 2004, and I thought I can't leave service now when we're in the middle of combat operations. And so that just led to some promotions, and the service was always great. And I tell you, same thing. I spent 4 years in the Pentagon as the Deputy Adjutant General in uniform before I retired. And I thought the Pentagon was the last place I wanted to spend any time. So when the opportunity for the General Counsel of the Air Force came up, that was a new thing. And I tell you what was interesting is, there are different cultures in the different services. And I got to see that firsthand. And there's also very much a difference between the civilian control of the military, the civilian general counsel, and the military, and the things they concentrate on. So as General Counsel of the Air Force, I started working on space, which I'd never worked before. I started working on acquisitions, big programs like Air Force One replacement, the KC-46, refueler, those types of programs. And I'd never worked on programs like that in uniform. So it was very different. And then the Voyager Space, but again, to me, it comes down to the prestige and preeminence of us as a nation. Again, we can't let the Chinese have the only space station up there. That's why one of the reasons I joined this outfit is because I knew what we were doing to try to get a commercial space station back up into orbit.
Well, I'll tell you, I was just remarking to somebody, my great regret that I never went and got my JD back when I was in my 20s. I did 3 years working for a blind lawyer as his reader and personal assistant, a former assistant attorney general. And I could have sat, if I'd stuck it out for another 2 years, I could have sat for the bar in Virginia, read into the bar and done it that way. But, do you miss it? Do you miss being in the courtroom at all, or have you just left all of that behind?
No, I think that I'm kept busy enough on new things. Here With Voyager Space, we've acquired 3 companies in the last year and a half. So the whole mergers and acquisitions, all the documents and negotiations going with that, I would say it's not competitive like the courtroom in some ways, right? You want to ensure that your side's winning in those engagements. And so that's a lot of fun. And then again, just all of the different partnerships that we have, and to build a space station, right? We need to be a partner with lots of folks, and we need to do that on the best terms, and in a way that we're going to be long-term partners. And so that's been a lot of fun. So I have plenty of interactions that are not as contentious as courtrooms, but I don't miss that as much. Many ways, I would say the contention of courtroom is for the young.
Sure, I get that. I understand that. So listen, before I let you go, because I'm going to be a little selfish here. My family's getting ready to do a vacation in Colorado. We're very excited about this. What is it like now living permanently in Colorado? What are you doing for fun when you have free time? Assuming you have free time, what are you up to?
Right. Well, so if I look out my window behind me here, well, first I've got the Lego rocket behind me,
nice,
which is great. But I can see west to the Front Range, the mountains that are out of our building here. And that's where I live. I live in Golden. I would definitely go to Golden if you were going to be there. The biggest beer factory in the world is located there. And but I'm up at 7,700 feet, so Denver is a mile high, so I'm another 2,000 feet up, and there's elk, deer, fox all the time in the front yard, backyard. There's great hiking trails, and so I do a lot of hiking up there. And in fact, before I moved here a year and a half ago, I'd never skied out west. I'd skied in the Alps when I lived in Europe. I'd skied all through the east, even skied at Liberty there, as small as that slope is. So coming here to these big hills was a big change.
Yeah, my wife is the skier in the family, and she always misses that. Well, General Thomas Ayres, thank you so very much for joining us today, good sir.
And thank you very much, Andrew.
And thank you all for tuning in today to this episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. Please, if you like the show, leave a review. If you're listening, go and check out our YouTube videos. If you're watching us on YouTube, you can catch us on all major podcast platforms. As I've said, I'm Andrew Langer. Have a great week, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.